Today's guest is Douglas Hubbard. He's the manager of Power Apps Center of Excellence. They call it PACE for Transport Canada. And Douglas is in the Microsoft 365 community, something that's near and dear to my heart. And so I've had an opportunity to connect with him, and I just invited him on the podcast, and I thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'm really happy to be here. This is my first shot at being on a podcast.
Well, I'm happy to be your first in that regard. For those who have not met you or had a chance to dialogue with you, talk a bit about yourself. Where are you from, who you are, and what you do?
Great. So I'm from Canada. I'm actually living outside, not too far from Ottawa, which is the nation's capital. I work for Transport Canada. The federal government is a very strong presence in Ottawa. It's probably not that much different from those of you in the United States in terms of that it's all part of the same Western democracy government structures. There's a little bit differences here and there. We call it the Crown, for example, versus the state. But I've been working as an employee for about 10 years. Before that, I was a consultant, where my consultancy work was in the federal government. And I did that for quite a long time, but then I made this shift to becoming an employee, mostly because I was shifting at that time from the part of developing the software solutions to moving into more of a team lead and ultimately a management position. So what I'm doing now is, I'll be honest, I don't do a lot of tech anymore, but my job as I see it is to make sure all the smart people can do all their tech, and I run interference for them by doing the HR and the people management and the paperwork, the paper pushing, the financials, all that sort of thing. But it's a rewarding opportunity because when I was still a consultant, it wasn't a question of you weren't well compensated. I had good per diem. However, it was very, for lack of a better term, it was monotonous in the sense that you had a very specific, very small task. You sat in your little tiny share of a cubicle. You did the exact same thing day in, day out. I don't lack for variety now. There's never a lack of something going on. I won't say it's always fun, but it is very much more interesting, and it is certainly more of a sense of you're making a difference, at least some days, because I help shape, sometimes anyways, the strategy and policy of the entire IT section of the department. Now, I'm a manager. I'm not a senior executive, but I'm very unusually positioned in that most of the time managers, at least where I am, are focused on leading a team or two doing large-scale capital projects with some maintenance. This is important work, but you tend to be very focused. Sometimes you're so focused, you don't even see the silo around you. Whereas at PACE, we work very hard to try and supply solutions, ideas, principles, guidance, all these things that are very much enterprise level. So I have an unusual opportunity to do a lot more strategic work, even as a mere manager. I'm at the bottom of the salt here. I'm at least sitting at the leadership table, but I'm at the very bottom of the salt. But I get to see how the big people play anyways, and I get to do some strategy and planning and operations that lend towards those big pictures. Doesn't have to be tech necessarily. The fact that we built our structure for Power Apps using an enterprise licensing scheme, for example, where I looked at it from saying, okay, we're buying a la carte. That's not working. That's insane. Let's buy it in a few thousands instead. And this is one of those things that it was cheaper to buy 3,000 licenses than it was to buy 3 separate lots of 300.
Yeah, a lot of people don't think about that strategic purchasing, the strategic management of the resource. And I would agree with you, at being a manager myself, even though I'm not touching the tech like I did before, it doesn't mean that the knowledge of how to touch that tech it's invaluable as you try to kind of craft strategy.
Absolutely. I understand enough that I can work from the information I'm given, especially from the very smart people. I'm very fortunate to work with some absolute experts in their field. I understand it enough that I can craft it into a format that is suitable to go to the executive, which is act as a translator, or perhaps more an archaeologist, because sometimes am I right? Some of the Microsoft licensing, you might as well be trying to read Sanskrit. So that keeps me in my job, because I'm the only person apparently who's able to decipher what it is that they're trying to. How many times have they changed the name of the Power Apps license, for example? But we persevere.
The SKUs on the enterprise agreements are an art form.
Yes, and we have the extra complexity of that we actually have to buy our product through a particular branch of the federal government as well, because they have a cloud agreement, which is not a bad idea from a centralized, making sure everybody's on the same page, but it adds an extra level of processing. So it's not something I look forward to every year to renew the licenses, but it's always worth doing in the end, at least.
So let's roll the clock back a little. We don't have to say how far that clock is. We both have gray hair. But let's roll the clock back a little to when you were in high school or coming out of high school. Did you know what you wanted to do?
Yes, yes, I did. In that I was sure I wanted to be in engineering and quite possibly in some sort of computerish engineering, because I'll be honest, this was the mid 1980s. So software engineering and computer engineering as we see it now was really not the same, because it was still very much mainframes, mini computers. I mean, I was not in the basement. I was in the sub basement, because my dad had built a den slash office that actually had another flight of stairs down from the regular basement. So in this super dingy area was where we had our Apple II plus, Apple III plus. And that was my exposure to a computer. So I thought, oh, I want to keep doing this. This would be a good plan. And my uncle was an engineer at that time, in the sense that he was working for a while at a university back when, you were typing on a typewriter and the response came out on a printer. So in any event, it all looked pretty cool to me. So I thought I'd give it a try. What did change for me when I went to university is that I'm glad this was the case. My particular university, Queens in Kingston, they didn't have discipline selection in your first year. You actually had a common first year, and then you were able to decide
Hmm,
what discipline you wanted to go into.
I like that.
Well, it was really good. Now, the downside is that you had to take drafting and geology and things like that. So if you were absolutely sure you're going to electrical engineering, you weren't all that keen about the geology. And frankly, no one uses the drafting now, but at the time it was interesting. And as a result of that first year, I actually ended up going into mining engineering, which is obviously not what you would expect on the face of
Yeah.
it. But in actual fact, one of the biggest computer users in the department or in the whole university was actually the mining department, because they had jumped in with both feet. There's not a lot of mining schools in Canada, and Queens is actually one of the best in the country, if not the best. So they were really leveraging a lot of computing power just doing 3D modeling and mine design, for example. They were just massive consumers of energy. But these were really, really top shelf profs too. I had a professor for drilling and blasting that he was one of the 3 people in the world who was authorized, that if it ever came about to make sense, to use nuclear devices in
Hmm,
demolitions.
wow.
So talk about the top shelf people. He also had a lab assistant who used to be an SBS. So he was, what should we say, very good for the hands-on labs about going out and trying out how to use the explosives. It also was an extremely good way to put yourself through university, which was what I was doing in my case, because I wouldn't say the working conditions were ideal, but the pay is very good working in a mine. So
Oh,
I did my summers working underground, and that was a good way to make some money. And then after one summer where there was unfortunately 2 accidents in the span of a few weeks with a couple of deaths, I realized that maybe I didn't want to be in mining either. So then I flipped over to computer science, and here I am. But it wasn't a waste of time by any means, because I learned a lot in both programs.
yeah, I imagine. Uh, Certainly there's going to be a lot of math in mining, right? A lot of calculation.
Yes.
I'm always fascinated to hear about other career paths that I could have taken and then realized the education might have been even bigger requirement than what I actually did. Uh, I managed to be one of those people who got a computer science degree and dodged almost all the math because I
Ah,
was I
okay.
was focused on business systems rather than real computer science. I wasn't building, analytical models or anything that needed formulas. I'm building web interfaces when I finally got around to going to university.
It was still worth it. I think more of it was the social aspect, the chance I got to meet people. There's folks I'm
Mm.
still friends with from all those years ago. Again, I wouldn't recommend working in Snow Lake, Manitoba to anybody. That was a little too isolated, but it did put me through university. Otherwise, I would have struggled. So I'm not complaining. And sure, I learned a lot about mineralogy that doesn't really have a lot of practical implications now, but it was still interesting at the time. And I will say that I, in terms of useful skills in what I'm doing in my job right now, certainly the programming languages I learned have very little value. Pascal and Fortran are not exactly all the rage nowadays, but there were still things that I picked up. There's a couple courses. There's ones about, for example, software engineering from a design principles perspective.
Hmm.
Are you familiar with Frederick Brooks, because
Yeah.
I still have I still have my copy of the Mythical Man Month right here, because the stuff in that relatively thin volume has given me more insight in how to operate in the IT world than just about anything else I picked up in 5 years of school.
Mhm. That's a
So
great
if
book.
anybody's interested, Mythical Man Month by Frederick P. Brooks Jr. Got it right here, the old-fashioned version with the Smilodon on it. And I guess if you, it doesn't talk about tech as much as it just talks about smart ways to try and operate and run software projects. And I would almost say that it's useful for anybody who wants to do project management. There's a lot of good concepts in that. But yes, it's a good read. Good read if you can find it.
Yeah, there's some really good classic foundational concepts out there that I agree with you are very helpful and aren't specifically tech, right? I remember when I was a software engineer and I was building systems and I purchased a book from my probably A Press or one of the big publishers, Rocks or whatever. There's been a number of them over the years. And it was on the black art of software estimation. It was a really thick volume, and you get to the very end of it, and it basically says, guess. Because there's just no way. Everything is so different. There's no way to really estimate. It's really estimation based on past experience.
Yes. Yes, that's what we tell ourselves to make justify why we think it's okay to that the gray hairs were worth something. The fact that
That's
all that
right.
experience could be channeled into something valuable.
So now, as you were coming out of university, how did you land the first job besides the one you did while you were in school?
Well, it was a question of Kingston's not a very big city, which is where I went to school, and a job that would normally require bachelor's degree at that time would actually require a master's degree, and that people were very, very technically skilled in that area just because of an overabundance of graduates compared to the actual city
Hmm.
size. I'll be perfectly honest, the opportunities were pretty much all in Ottawa. It was either Ottawa or Toronto or Montreal. Toronto, Montreal are the biggest cities, so two of the biggest cities in the country. Toronto by far the largest. I'm not a big fan of living in that urbanized of an area. And in Montreal, it's always prudent. It's not a requirement, but it would be a really good idea if my bilingualism, my ability to speak French was better. I grew up in a part of Ontario where there wasn't a lot of French, so my French was very weak at that time. And my eventual wife, but not at that time, but someone I was already dating, all her family was in Ottawa. So long story short, I figured I'd try it in Ottawa. Didn't look like I'd be able to get a job directly with the government, so I started working with various firms doing consulting work. And I went from a couple different firms until I settled on a really, really good one. And then after about 5 years there, I developed enough of my own skills that I went out as my own small company. And then I kept doing contract work for the government until somebody convinced me to join 10 years ago.
No, that's very interesting because it takes a special gumption, if you will, to start your own business. What ultimately led to you wanting to start your own business?
I wish I could say it was a more noble thing, but it really came down to avarice because the way it works, at least in our neck of the woods, is that if you're a consultant and you are subcontracting through a consulting firm, they will take a portion for holding what they call the standing offer or the vehicle that allows you to work. And for a little while in Canada, anyways, it was possible if you'd earned enough credibility to contract with the government directly. So therefore, there was no middleman.
Hmm.
And and I'd already, be honest with you, I had already made the step to becoming a corporation anyways, because otherwise you're either an employee, you have to be an employee. If you become, for tax reasons and legality reasons, at least in Canada, when you make your own corporation, now you can subcontract. And it's not as if I was getting any benefits or such working as an employee anyhow, because these are all smaller companies. Now, there's certainly not as much guarantee of working, but to put in perspective, I was, let me do the math. I believe I worked as a consultant, either myself or subcontracting for 17 years before I had a break where I actually couldn't find a job, and that only lasted 6 weeks. So it ended up being a pretty good risk reward scenario.
Yeah.
Now, they did change the rules. In the end, I had to subcontract again. But even so, I was still worth doing, and I was able to negotiate with the companies in question and so on and so forth. But honestly, after doing that for a long time, I started doing work that was well paid, but it wasn't satisfying.
Hmm.
So when a department that I had worked for and done some contracts for, that they were very happy with my efforts, they said, "Can you come back and work for us as an employee?" There was certainly a pay cut, but at that point I was in my 40s, and the thought of perhaps having a little bit more job security and actually having an albeit very small, but a possible pension when I retired and that sort of thing, it seemed alluring. Now,
Mhm.
unfortunately, my current situation doesn't actually mean my retirement may ever occur or last for very long. But on the other hand, it also allowed me an opportunity to not be off for a really long period of time a couple of years ago. So without running out of money. So I gotta say it was still a good choice in the long run. And I'm glad I did it.
Yeah, so what you said you took a pay cut, so that would certainly say it wasn't a financial decision, and I like what you say there. I work for the U.S. federal government. There's some similar rationale when you
Mhm.
make that leap. But I want to imagine, based on your experience doing the consulting, there might have also been some, having been a consultant myself, some I wish I was the government so I could do this differently.
Sometimes, absolutely sometimes. And again, I can't speak to anywhere else, but generally speaking, it varies from place to place. It varies from place to place, to be perfectly honest. But consultants are not employees. Consultants are non-personnel. There are some people who take the non-personnel very seriously in that you're come out of the furniture budget, so therefore you are furniture.
Yeah.
But there are many more people who don't treat you that way. But it is different. If you're a consultant, you don't have, I'm going back. I'm going back to say the 90s and the early 2000s when I made these decisions, or even 2010, 2014, is that you don't get the same working conditions.
Right.
Again, COVID and the return to office completely changed things. But back in that point in time, you probably had the smallest cubicle, or you had to share a cubicle. You certainly got the not as nice equipment.
Right.
And there is sometimes a bit of a cultural difference because you're not an actual employee.
Mm.
So that was part of my decision. I didn't want to be in that situation anymore. Now, most people are an employee, and then when they're ready, they become a consultant. So they have 20 or 30 years of possible pension, and then they become an employee. Sorry, then a consultant. So I did it in the exact reverse. But it does turn out that that worked out okay because I alluded to this a little earlier. Just about 3 years ago, just shy of 3 years ago, I found out I had cancer, and unfortunately, it had reached stage 4 before it was even detected. And that was where it turned out that having become an employee was helpful because it was much easier to arrange leave. I had some incredible support by everybody in my, both my executive director, my director general, everybody was behind me. So the fact that I couldn't work for months, we sorted it out. I mean, I
Mm.
would have been with zero pay for the entire time otherwise. It was a long road back, but they were very supportive to me. And I'm glad that I had that because here I am back at work, almost at my full capacity. Some days are harder than others, but it was a really good thing. It turns out that wasn't the reason why I made it. I thought it would be for a longer term benefit post retirement, but it was the right choice. It turns out that safety net was good to have.
Yeah, there are a lot of pros and cons, and I would say another benefit of having been a prior consultant, I'm speaking for you, but you can confirm based on my own experience, is you have a understanding of what that relationship is like. As you said, some consultants are treated like furniture. Well, you would know how that's felt. And then when you're now in the government position and have an opportunity to have consultants work for you, you can then say, well, that's not the way I want to treat those people.
That's right. Absolutely. I do not make a distinction myself between them. The only things that I do are required by the fact that they are not employees. There's not an employee-employer relationship. It's actually very important to not maintain that. So you don't want a situation where somebody's working 5 days a week, same hours, same thing over and over, year after year. So we work very hard to avoid that in general in the department, and I try to support that as well. But I will say one thing I do not cotton to at all for consultants. Well, it's two things. One is that they always have to play straight with me, and that if they start trying to bill me for time that they didn't work, that's a quick way out the door because we're paying you very well and you should not be trying
Hmm.
that kind of stuff. with a subsection too as well, is that they don't get to pick their hours. This whole, well, I thought I'd work at 5 o'clock in the morning or maybe on the weekends when there's nobody to know what you're doing. No, that's not going to fly either. And the second thing is that we're not here to train you. That's one of the big differences, that any scenario where the consultant is starting to use the Crown's money and time to learn how to do stuff, you've not set up the proper situation.
Yeah.
But the onus ultimately is on myself as a manager. I should be creating and maintaining situations where the consultants are the right people doing what they should be doing, which is you're paying them a specific amount of money to do specific tasks, and they
Yeah.
should know what they're doing and hit the ground running. So if you
Uh,
get the right people and you make sure that the situation is not that they're twiddling on their fingers or thinking that they can basically book their own hours or that sort of thing, it can work. It can work. I have fantastic consultants, and I've had strong working relationships with some of them from project to project over the years. But ultimately, you shouldn't just be pointing your fingers at a consultant, because if you're the manager, you're supposed to be looking after the situation, not them.
That's true. Wow. The words of wisdom for people who are interacting from a government perspective with consultants. Those are all.
And well, I'm glad to hear that. So at least we're going to have hopefully some useful information for your podcast. The thing is I find that I've been on both sides of the fence, like just about everything. There's strengths and weaknesses to both, right? I mean, there are lots of good things about being a consultant, but there are also benefits of being an employee. There's good things being in the private sector. There's good things in the public sector. If I could offer advice to people, there's nothing wrong with dabbling, especially if you do decide to go to university or college. I try to bring in people from university as summer students or co-op students so they can at least try it out. Some people like it. Some say this is not for me. And that's valid. Both are valid opinions, but the best way to know is to try, right? You won't know. I've done both sides of the fence. At my point in life, I'm happy I'm an employee. I'm happy I'm a manager, because, as I alluded to further, it's not that the consulting work was bad, but it wasn't as rewarding, in the sense that I was not affecting anything other than whatever little piece of the pie I was given to do as part of one project in a much bigger machine. You don't have any context, you just do your thing. That's okay for a while. It's the reason why my kids had a roof over their head and food on the table. That's a good long-term goal. But at a certain point, they were starting to become more autonomous and they were talking back anyways. So why should they be fed? And I thought it was time to think more about me. And I really said to myself, is this what I want to be stuck doing? Do I want to be dreading what I'm doing going into work for another 20 years? I said, no, I definitely don't want to do that. So when the offer came, I thought, why not? Let's give it a go. And it led me to be able to be on a group like PACE and an opportunity to talk to you and to speak at people in conferences. So I really shouldn't have any complaints, because it worked out all right.
Agreed. So, Douglas, looking back, I'm sure in your career you've seen a few things. What's something that you saw and you were like, man, I wish we didn't do it that way? And I'm gonna caveat this and say, uh, you don't have to have a solution, right? This may be a big problem. It may require a whole change management project, and let's get everybody on board and let's all agree not to do this way. But it's certainly something we should at least begin to consider. What's something you see or you've seen and you think we should reconsider?
This is going to sound a little counterintuitive, considering that we're both coming from an IT background. I think we get a little too hung up or a little too fixated on the tech. And I'll
Hmm.
try and clarify what I mean by that, in that we have a situation where tech is always changing, things are always changing, but, oh, did I lose you?
And your video froze for some reason.
Yes, yours is gone. Yours is done. Yours is done. Oh, we're back. Okay.
All right,
All right. So anyways, let me see. Is it okay? I'll just start again. I'm
start
sure
that
you've got
again.
this
Yep.
place and keep this. Okay. This may sound a little counterintuitive, but I would say that we focus too much on tech. What I mean by that is, first of all, at the risk of sounding really old, I've seen more than one, this is the greatest thing ever. And that isn't to say they weren't valuable or important things, and they were usually led to even better things. But the same way that, say, Clipper was seen as the replacement to DBase because it was so much better than DBase, well, who uses Clipper anymore? And as much as I am a proponent of Power Platform, because obviously my team's bread and butter is Power Platform, at some point there's going to be something else. Maybe it's going to be AI, maybe it's going to be Power Platform 2. Well, look at it this way. When you look at La Pieta or the Sistine Chapel, are you worried about what kind of chisel that was used or what paintbrush? You're looking at the finished product and saying, what a magnificent thing. So we need to focus as an industry and as managers, if you are in management, on yes, the tools are important, but what are you doing to make sure you have good craftsmen? And another end of that is that I speak to a lot of government departments, and they always ask me, one of their first questions is, how did you ever get this center of excellence going? Because we can't get anywhere. Like, how did you get a center of excellence? How do you get all these projects out? How did you win awards? And I'm sounding a little boastful here, but I mean, I have a couple of national government awards because of what my team has done. And then I find out what's happened is that they try to pitch stuff to their executive and they're way down in the weeds talking about maybe how they could improve the facts that they're putting controls on a screen with UX. And it just, that's not what you want to be selling to people. You're trying to solve people's problems.
Yeah.
So you're trying to be the right tool for their job. Your director general, your super manager, your CIO is not interested in being that down in the weeds. They want to know that you can build stuff in a third the time at a half the cost because you've got a better way of doing it.
Mhm.
They're not interested in knowing the blow by blow details of the tech as long as the tech does the job and is not broadcasting information on TikTok. So I mean, you have to do due diligence, don't get me wrong, but we focus so much on the flavor of the day that we tend to lose sight, I think, in general in IT, that we're here to fix people's problems and it's the craftsman, not the tools.
Mm, that is so true. There's a working group that I've been a member of for many, many, many years. And I remember when the fresh new face of blockchain came out
Yes.
onto the play. And the very first thing we did was say, let's not talk about blockchain. Let's talk about why you would use it and why you wouldn't use it. And we produced like a playbook that said, let's take a step-by-step approach, evaluate your use case against this rubric of whatever, and then we'll tell you, guess what? Don't waste your time.
That's a good way to go about it. I can expand on that if I may. We have a situation right now where we're actually part of trying to establish a really efficient and transparent and consistent intake process for anyone who wants IT work. The reason why that's a challenge right now is that before about, I'm going to say 10 years ago, roughly, maybe 10, 15, hopefully no one's going to report me to transport if I gave the time wrong. The IT shops were actually dedicated for each mode, and by which I mean aviation had an IT team, marine had an IT team, rail had an IT team dedicated to try and build their stuff. Very good from a working with closely with your business colleagues, being able to make sure you can give them what they want, but it resulted in titanium grade silos. And now that we have all of the IT under one directorate, although there's usually each group is responsible for the mode still, the silos are getting better. But the truth of the matter is that what happens is that each mode, basically any kind of transportation has its own mode, tends to have its own desires, its own culture. And then if you want an IT system, you usually call up the person that you know the best and say, hey, can you build us something that does X? And what we're finding is that, unsurprisingly, the architecture is already being shaped by the person you've already talked to. Whoever you talk to first shapes the architecture. If you call me up, I'm going to say, well, yes, in theory, Power Apps could do that. We
Yeah.
have other groups that they consider Power Apps to be something that is stealing babies. They will say, well, the only possible solution is .NET Core or .NET of some flavor. And then we got some wackadoodles who think they want to use Appian, but that's a separate story. But so what we're trying to do is that the intake system we're building, the one we're using right now for PACE, which we're going to try and expand, because we actually put one in place because I had so many people asking us for help that I wanted to have a system that was actually being fair to everybody, saying, I'm sorry, you're fifth in the queue because you scored very low, but we can get to you probably in 6 months. Which, if they've been told by another team it's going to be 2 years minimum until they can be seen, that's still an improvement. Where I'm going with this is that the intake process is to focus exclusively on what is your problem. Because we've had teams come to us saying, we want you to build, say, a .NET solution. Well, with all respect to the people who have to do the hard work of doing the inspections or operating the business side of things, which is the whole point of the organization, it would not be a good idea, as far as I'm concerned, that you've already picked the technology going into even starting the question of can you build something? Why are we not doing an options analysis? Why are we not checking? Why are we not even finding what your problem is first? Because sometimes it's not tech, or
Right.
certainly it's not only tech. Because if anybody's seen the situation where you've just taken an Adobe PDF and thrown it up online, or taking a paper form and turned it into a PDF online, and that's it, you may have wasted an opportunity there to actually improve your process. Because some of the things that I've seen, and I'm sure it's everywhere in any large organization, but it's so ponderous. It's so ponderous. It's so unwieldy. Why are we not looking at trying to move it out of a purely paper-based? If you're moving it out of a purely paper-based solution, maybe you should try to adapt your process to take advantage of that opportunity rather than just adding in some automation around a still very waterfall or paper process.
Yeah.
Like, why are you printing things off and sending it for approval? Why is someone printing a thing and signing it, then you're scanning it and putting it back in? Things like that.
Mm. No, that's great. That's a great thing. Yes, there is still a large, and I don't know, it's because we're tech obsessed as a culture, but there is still a large focus on, oh, that's the technology that's going to be. They think it's funny because I see advertisements on television or YouTube or wherever, and I go, who are they targeting with that ad? Well, they're targeting those people because those are the people that come to me and say, I want this tool. And I'm like, why? And they're like, I want this tool.
Right. I don't want to be sounding like Luddite, because it's very important we look at every
Oh
technology
no,
and see how it
absolutely.
can be best used. We're very happy with the Power Platform's done for us, for example. And I didn't pick that third of the time, half of the cost out of the air. That's actually what we're finding as a minimum in terms of our improvement. And for anybody curious about why it's a third and a half, is because we need consultants out of the very best. So the cost of getting a top shelf consultant in Power Platform is more than in .NET. But I can say, if you're in a situation where you knowledge, if you can find the right consultant and you have to pay more for them, that's still better than buying two lesser lights, because you'll get more for your value getting the very best person, especially if you make sure they train. Because the motto of PACE from the very start, when I first started even pitching this to the executive in my little decks and things, teaching people how to fish.
Yeah.
So that's what we do. Well, I don't directly. I mean, I have the good people on my team do that, but we were never meant to be the only people who knew Power Platform. So we bring in developers, we teach them our embedded developer concept. We make sure we work with citizen developers on fusion teams, and we slowly but surely promulgate that knowledge. And the more they know, the stronger we are as an organization.
So
And the
true.
less, then the more crazy it makes all the people with the tinfoil hats on to say the Power Platform can't do anything more complicated than order a pizza. So
So, do you have anything coming up here in the near future? I know you speak at events. You may not have one scheduled right now, but I thought I'd check.
at this point in time, I'm not looking at anything else for calendar 2024. I just came off the Dynamics Con, the Doug Con in 2024 that was in Denver. That was a great experience. I did two speaking engagements there. Well, keep an eye out. You never know. I did try to go to Power Platform, so unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to be a speaker there. We'll see. But I will say that hopefully I'll be speaking sometime sooner than later, because it is something I really, really enjoy. It was when I was just coming off my recovery from the cancer, the cancer surgery, that I got the opportunity to speak at the first one in first Power Platform conference, I should say, in Orlando, and it was so invigorating. Because anybody who's wondering, I don't smoke a pack of cigarettes a day. I sound like this because the stage 4 cancer has cost me a few things, including half my vocal cords. So I have trouble speaking. So being able to actually go in front of a live audience and talk about something that matters to me, and people were listening and they said, you did a good job. People actually say to me, hey, you're a great presenter. I'll let you in on a secret. This microphone's really important. But speaking of technology, with the right technology, I can get the job done. I actually had a lot of great help at both conferences, including the Dynamics Con. They gave me the fancy Britney Spears headset, the nice little pink one. Looks very snappy. I could share a picture of how dapper I look in the with a little headset, but it makes such a difference, because people like that, the people who help you like that, it makes all the difference in the world. And if anybody out there would like to have somebody at their conference, please feel free to reach me, because I'm always looking for speaking engagements, because it really helps me feel like I'm still alive and I'm still able to do my job properly, or better yet, do my job well.
Well, Douglas, I thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and I look forward to seeing you speak at a future event, and whatever else may be in store for you.
Well, thank you very much. I really do appreciate this opportunity. It was fun. Podcasts are cool.